There's a rule book for how you're supposed to win a war, a plan, a doctrine. But what if following that book is a suicide pact? In 1942, the American war machine was being defeated not by the enemy, but by its own bureaucracy. This is the story of a secret rebellion, of the men who realized the only way to win was to break every rule, defy their own admirals, and commit the greatest logistical crime of the Second World War. The soft rustle of old paper come closer. Let me show you something. Here, in this quiet room, under the glow of this single lamp, is where most wars are actually fought. Not on the beaches, not in the sky, but here, on paper, on a map. Look at this one. The Pacific Ocean, January 1942. It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? A vast, deep blue, sprinkled with islands like forgotten jewels. To the strategists in Washington, men who had spent their entire lives in rooms like this map represented a chessboard, a grand problem of time, distance, and force. The plan, codenamed Rainbow 5, was a work of cold, clean logic. A majestic, step-by-step naval promenade from Hawaii to the Philippines, rolling back the Japanese empire island by island. It was elegant. It was precise. And in the weeks after the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, it was a complete and utter fantasy. To understand why, you have to stop seeing this as a map. You have to see it through the eyes of a man like Lieutenant Commander Frank Reagan. Reagan wasn't a strategist. He was a civil engineer from Omaha who, until a year ago, spent his days worrying about soil compaction for municipal dams. He was a man of physics, of concrete, of knowable stresses and measurable loads. His world was governed by the unwavering laws of the physical world. Now, he wore navy blue, and his job was to translate the confident arrows drawn on this map into the brutal reality of steel, concrete, and sweat. Imagine you're him. It's late. The building is silent, but Washington hums with a quiet, desperate energy. The air in the office is thick with the ghosts of yesterday's cigars and the smell of old radiators hissing against the winter chill. Reagan is alone, bent over a chart table, the lamplight carving his face out of the shadows. For hours, he has been staring at this same map, not as a grand chessboard, but as an engineer's nightmare. The admirals want to move an army, a fleet, an air force, across thousands of miles of hostile water. To a strategist, that's a matter of fuel and logistics. To Reagan, it's a question of physics. An army needs barracks. A fleet needs a deep water port with piers, machine shops, and dry docks. An air force needs runways, not dirt strips, but 1,000-yard stretches of packed coral and asphalt strong enough to handle a B-17 bomber landing with its belly full of ordnance. It needs fuel farms, munitions depots, hospitals, and mess halls. You don't just need to move an army. You need to move a dozen American cities, piece by agonizing piece, and rebuild them on the other side of the world. And this is where the anomaly appears. This is the moment the plan on paper collides with the unforgiving truth of the world. Reagan takes a pair of calipers, the cold steel a familiar weight in his hand. He measures the distance from Pearl Harbor to the first logical objective. Then he moves the calipers, leapfrogging from island to tiny island across the map. With each movement, the silence in the room seems to grow heavier. Because the map is lying. A single teletype machine clattering in the background. So, how do you answer an impossible order? How do you fulfill a general's demand to create land where there is none and build a city where there is only jungle? Well, in 1942, the official answer was simple. You call on the professionals. In Washington, the problem of a Fateh and the 1,000 other islands like it landed on the polished desks of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, the very department where Frank Reagan now worked. You have to understand what this organization was. It was, for all intents and purposes, the oldest and most methodical construction company on the planet. For over a century, they had built the American empire in brick and stone. They built the dry docks in Norfolk, the naval yards at Mare Island, the coaling stations in the Philippines. They were meticulous. They were precise. And they were, by the standards of a global war, catastrophically slow. Their entire system was a creature of peacetime. To build a pier, you would first dispatch a team of surveyors. They would spend months mapping the seabed. Then, a team of architects in Washington would draw up blueprints, thousands of them, specifying every bolt and every beam. These plans would be approved by a committee, then another committee. Contracts would be tendered. Civilian companies would be hired. Specialized equipment would be manufactured and shipped. It was a process designed to build structures that would last for 100 years, and it took nearly as long. This was the official explanation. The plan, as it existed on paper, was to simply export this entire industrial process into the Pacific. They would use civilian contractors, men who punched a clock and expected a hot meal and a dry bed. They would ship the equipment, the men, and the mountain of paperwork, and they would build their bases the right way. On the surface, it's the only logical answer. It's how a superpower is supposed to function. It's organized, it's responsible, and it leverages the full might of American industry. But here is where the official report goes silent. This is where the clean logic of the plan begins to bleed. Imagine you're building a magnificent, intricate bridge across a river. Your engineers are brilliant, your materials are the best in the world, and your blueprints are a work of art. Now, imagine that while you are carefully sinking the first caisson, the enemy is on the other side of the river, building their own bridge with prefabricated parts, working 24 hours a day under floodlights, and they have artillery zeroed in on your construction site. Your methodical, perfect plan is no longer a strategy. It's a suicide pact. That was the reality in the Pacific. And for Frank Reagan, the first piece of hard, undeniable evidence came not from an admiral's briefing, but from a grainy, black-and-white photograph dropped on his light table. The photo was taken by a lone PBY Catalina, flying a high-altitude reconnaissance mission over the Solomon Islands. The target was a small, jungle-choked island called Tulagi. Intelligence expected to see maybe a few Japanese patrols, a temporary camp. What Reagan saw instead sent a jolt of ice water through his veins. He bent closer, his magnifying glass tracing the strange, unnatural lines carved into the pristine jungle. Those weren't footpaths. They were too wide, too straight. That wasn't a camp. It was a grid of barracks under construction. And there, near the beach, was the most terrifying sight of all the unmistakable shape of construction equipment. Not just shovels and picks, but heavy machinery. Dredgers, earth movers. Japanese engineers were not just occupying the island, they were transforming it. They were building a seaplane base, a forward operating post from which to sever the lifeline between America and Australia. Suddenly, the problem wasn't just about building American bases. It was about the timeline. The slow, deliberate peacetime process of the Bureau of Yards and Docks was planning in terms of months, even years. The Japanese were building in weeks. Every sunrise that saw American surveyors still taking measurements was a sunrise that saw another Japanese runway nearing completion, another harbor being dredged, another dagger being sharpened and aimed at the heart of the Allied war effort. The grainy photograph from Tulagi was the contradiction. It was the first clue in a horrifying investigation. It proved that the enemy was not just a military force to be fought, but an industrial force to be outbuilt. The official explanation, so comforting and logical in the quiet halls of Washington, was now exposed for what it was. It wasn't just wrong. It was fatally naive. And the clock was ticking louder than anyone had ever imagined. Photograph from Tulagi was more than just a picture of an enemy base. It was a single frame from a much larger, much more terrifying film. And in the frantic weeks that followed, in the hushed, urgent atmosphere of Admiral Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the rest of that film began to play out. More reconnaissance flights were launched. Coast watchers, brave Australian planters, and colonial officers hiding in the jungle with a teleradio began to whisper their reports across the ether. The pieces of the puzzle started snapping into place, and the image they formed was that of a nightmare. Tulagi wasn't an isolated outpost. It was a link in a chain. The Japanese were consolidating their massive fortress at Rabaul. They were building airfields at La and Salamaua on New Guinea. They were forging a great, sweeping arc of fortified islands, an oceanic iron curtain designed to do one thing: sever the artery between the United States and Australia. This is where we need a war college briefing, because the strategic danger here is subtle, but absolutely lethal. Imagine you're in a prize fight. Your opponent is bigger, and right now, he's stronger. But you have endurance, and you have a trainer in your corner who can give you water, patch your cuts, and send you back out for the next round. Now, what if your opponent's strategy isn't to knock you out, but to spend the first few rounds methodically, brutally, taking out your trainer? If he can isolate you in the ring, cut you off from all support, your eventual defeat is no longer a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. In this fight, Australia was the boxer, battered but still standing. America was the trainer in the corner. And that chain of Japanese island bases was the opponent's fist, aimed directly at the lifeline between them. If that chain was completed, Australia would be completely isolated. The millions of American soldiers and the mountains of equipment heading that way would have nowhere to go. The entire southern anchor of the Allied war in the Pacific would vanish. It was a strategy of strangulation, of logistical asphyxiation. The war of logistics had begun, and America was already losing. This new, terrifying reality rendered Washington's official plan, the slow, methodical construction by civilian contractors, obsolete. It was worse than obsolete, it was suicidal. You can't ask a civilian surveyor to map a beach while enemy snipers are hiding in the tree line. You can't expect a Union crane operator, paid by the hour, to keep working while Mitsubishi bombers are dropping presents from 10,000 feet. The enemy had fused the roles of builder and soldier. They had created construction battalions that could fight. The United States had construction contracts. The stakes were now terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a race to build a few bases. It was a race to invent an entirely new way of war before the enemy could lock the final door and trap them out of the Pacific forever. The clock wasn't ticking in months anymore. It was ticking in days. Frank Reagan was there, in a crowded, desperate meeting at the Navy Department, when his boss, a crusty, brilliant chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks named Rear Admiral Ben Morrell, stood up and committed an act of heresy. He effectively tore up his own department's century-old rulebook. Then the thud of a stack of posters hitting a desk, "We build, we fight." It's a magnificent slogan. It sounds like something carved into the base of a monument. But in the winter of 1942, it was just words on a piece of paper in Admiral Morrell's office. An idea. A ghost. How do you give it flesh and blood? How do you conjure an army of warrior engineers out of thin air on a deadline that shrinks with every decoded Japanese signal? This is where the investigation turns from the strategic to the intensely human. And the first great clue in solving the riddle of the Pacific didn't come from a spy or a codebreaker. It came from a fundamental shift in thinking. Lieutenant Commander Frank Reagan was one of the men tasked with finding the answer. He and his small team, working under Morrell, realized they had been looking at the problem completely backward. Think of it this way. The Army's approach would be to take 1,000 young recruits, teach them how to march and fire a rifle for 16 weeks, and then give them a 2-week crash course on how to use a shovel. You would get 1,000 mediocre soldiers who were terrible carpenters. The Seabees idea, the clue that broke the case open, was to do the exact opposite. Don't find soldiers and teach them how to build. Find the men who already built America and teach them how to fight. It was a revelation, a key turning in a lock no one knew existed. And with that single idea, the entire machinery of naval recruitment was turned upside down. The hunt was on. They weren't looking for fresh-faced kids off the farm. They were looking for men with crow's feet around their eyes and grease permanently etched into the lines of their hands. They sent recruiters not to high schools, but to union halls, to construction sites, to the oil fields of Texas and the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest. Imagine the posters going up, not in post offices, but tacked to the side of a tool shed on a half-finished skyscraper in Manhattan. The posters didn't talk about glory or honor. They were job postings for the most dangerous construction project in human history. Can you weld? Can you drive a bulldozer? Wanted pile drivers, dredge operators, master electricians. The Navy has a job for you. And the men came. They came in droves. They were older, tougher, more independent than any recruiter had ever seen. Men in their 30s, 40s, even 50s. Men who had spent their lives wrestling with the physical world and winning. These were the men who built the Hoover Dam, the men who bored the tunnels for the New York subway system through the granite spine of Manhattan. They were the riggers who walked on high steel without fear, the sandhogs who worked under the crushing pressure of riverbeds. They were not impressed by shouting drill instructors, but they held a deep and abiding reverence for a well-drafted blueprint. The feeling in those recruiting stations was electric. It was pure, unfiltered optimism. Here, at last, was the answer. Here was the human solution to the physical problem. For every impossible task the Pacific demanded, there was a man in line who had spent the last 20 years solving a version of it. Need to build a pier on a treacherous coral reef? Here's a crew from Galveston who built oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico during hurricane season. Need to carve a runway out of a volcanic mountain? Here are the hard rock miners from Montana who chewed through the Rockies for a living. The creak of hawsers, distant sea birds, the ships of Operation Bobcat steamed south out of Charleston, their decks crammed with a chaotic jumble of bulldozers, cranes, and Quonset hut panels, all lashed down against the Atlantic swell. Below decks, the men of the 1st Naval Construction Battalion were a sea of weathered faces, a boisterous, confident tribe of master builders. They were the perfect tool, designed for a specific job. The mood was one of impatient optimism. The theory was sound, the men were experts, the equipment was the best on Earth. The dead end seemed impossible. But the Pacific Ocean is a graveyard of beautiful theories. And the enemy in this new kind of war wasn't just the Japanese. The true enemy, the one that lay in wait for them at Bora Bora, was the brutal, unforgiving tyrant of military operations reality. Imagine you're a master cabinet maker. You have the finest chisels, the rarest woods, a workshop filled with every tool imaginable. Your plan is to build a magnificent mahogany desk. But when you arrive at the job site, you discover 3 things. First, the delivery truck carrying your tools crashed, and half of them are at the bottom of a river. Second, the client failed to mention that the workshop has no electricity. And third, the beautiful mahogany planks you ordered have been replaced with a pile of wet, unseasoned pine. Your skills are useless. Your beautiful plan is a joke. You are a master without a medium. This was the dead end the Seabees slammed into at Bora Bora. The ships arrived. The men swarmed the decks, eager to get to work, only to be confronted by the first great lie of logistics. The ships had been loaded in Charleston according to a clerk's manifest, not a builder's logic. Vital engine parts for the bulldozers were buried under 1,000 tons of canned peaches. The welding equipment they needed on day 1 was at the bottom of a hold that would take 2 weeks to unload. It was called combat loading, where the last thing you'd need was loaded first. This was the opposite. It was a logistical nightmare orchestrated by someone who had never built anything more complicated than a model airplane. So they improvised. They became scavengers. They hot-wired generators, cannibalized parts from one machine to get another running. But then came the second assault from reality. The equipment itself. Those brand-new bulldozers, so powerful on the soft soil of a Carolina training ground, sank up to their radiators in the volcanic mud and crushed coral of the beach. The blades, designed for Earth, shattered against the unexpected density of basaltic rock. The finely tuned diesel engines, built for temperate climates, gasped and choked in the humid, salt-saturated air. The machines were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. And then came the final, crushing blow. The island itself was a lie. The maps they'd been given in Washington were little more than tourist sketches. The pristine, deep water channel marked on the chart turned out to be a labyrinth of submerged coral heads, invisible razor blades that could rip the hull out of a cargo ship. The flat, promising plain designated for the airfield was, in reality, a malarial swamp. Back in Washington, Frank Reagan read the first reports from Operation Bobcat with a growing sense of dread. The confident theory that you could simply transport American industrial might and plug it into a Pacific island was collapsing into a slow-motion catastrophe. Days turned into weeks. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. The men, these titans of industry, were reduced to back-breaking labor with picks and shovels, fighting a war not against the Japanese, but against their own broken equipment, against a hostile geology, and against the catastrophic incompetence of the planners back home. The enemy's genius was not in their military cunning, but in their profound understanding of this brutal reality. The Japanese weren't trying to build naval yards to rival Norfolk. They were building what worked, where it worked, with what they had. They used local materials. Their engineers knew the limitations of their machines and the treachery of the terrain. They were fighting with the island, while the Americans were fighting against it. The promising lead, the idea that you could just ship American know-how overseas, was a dead end. It was a trap laid not by an enemy admiral, but by their own arrogance. The men on Bora Bora weren't conquerors of nature. They were prisoners of it, stranded 5,000 miles from home, with the clock ticking on the main front. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, stalked by the specter of failure and the dawning, terrifying realization that the entire strategy for winning the war in the Pacific was built on a foundation of sand. Fading into the rhythmic chugging of a makeshift engine failure has a sound. On Bora Bora, it was the sound of silence where the roar of heavy machinery should have been. It was the sound of shovels scraping against volcanic rock. For Frank Reagan, it was the sound of another damning report landing on his desk in Washington, a litany of broken parts, missed deadlines, and shattered expectations. For the men of the 1st Construction Battalion, hope was becoming just another rationed commodity, and it was running dangerously low. The grand experiment seemed to be ending not with a bang, but with the whimpering grind of stripped gears. But a breakthrough, when it comes, rarely arrives with a trumpet blast from high command. It doesn't come from a new piece of technology or a brilliant strategic insight. In the story of the Seabees, the breakthrough came from the mud. It came from the grease-stained hands and the quiet, stubborn genius of men who saw not a dead end, but a puzzle. And here, in the legends of the battalions, the story of this breakthrough is always tied to one man, a figure who embodies the spirit of Seabee ingenuity. He is known as Chief Petty Officer John L. Pappy Haynes. Haynes wasn't an officer. He wasn't an engineer with a university degree. He was a black gang sailor, a machinist's mate who had spent 30 years in the hot, deafening engine rooms of Navy destroyers. He was a master of the art of jury-rigging, the sailor's term for fixing the unfixable with nothing but scrap metal, ingenuity, and profanity. To a man like Pappy Haynes, a broken machine wasn't a tragedy, it was a personal insult. A challenge. While the officers were staring at their useless blueprints and the logisticians were bemoaning their tangled supply lines, Haynes was walking through the boneyard of broken equipment. It was a graveyard of American industrial might, bulldozers with shattered blades, cranes with snapped cables, generators with cracked engine blocks. To everyone else, it was a monument to their failure. To Pappy Haynes, it was a hardware store. The first hint of the breakthrough came from the island's most frustrating feature, the coral. It was everywhere. On the beaches, it shredded truck tires. Underwater, it ripped open ship hulls. When dug up, it was too soft and crumbly to form a solid base for a runway. It was the physical manifestation of their enemy. One afternoon, Haynes was watching a bulldozer fruitlessly trying to clear a patch of jungle. Its blade, designed for soft earth, would either get stuck or simply shatter against the volcanic rock hidden just beneath the soil. The driver, a frustrated kid from Illinois, finally gave up, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Haynes walked over, squinting at the broken blade. Then he looked at the pile of useless, excavated coral nearby. He walked over to the boneyard, grabbed a welding torch, and found a discarded, hardened steel plate from a wrecked pontoon. The other men watched, curious, as Haynes and his crew of machinists spent the next 2 days in a shower of sparks and smoke. They weren't repairing the bulldozer blade. They were redesigning it. They welded the hardened pontoon steel onto the front. But the real genius was what they did next. They welded a series of thick, savage-looking steel teeth fashioned from old leaf springs onto the bottom edge of the modified blade. When they were finished, it didn't look like a bulldozer anymore. It looked like a prehistoric monster, an armored beast with an underbite from hell. They fired it up. The kid from Illinois climbed back into the driver's seat, skeptical. He lowered the monstrous new blade and eased the machine forward. The effect was instantaneous and electrifying. The teeth bit into the ground, ripping through the volcanic rock like it was plywood. They tore up the jungle roots that had stalled them for weeks. And in its wake, it left a trail not just of cleared earth, but of perfectly pulverized coral, ground down into an aggregate that was ideal for mixing with cement or compacting into a rock-hard runway surface. They had not just solved the problem of clearing the land. In one single, brilliant act of battlefield engineering, they had turned the island's greatest weakness into its greatest strength. They had invented, on the spot, the rooter, a piece of equipment that would become standard issue for every construction battalion in the Pacific. This was the breakthrough. It came not from an official channel, but from an unlikely source, a grizzled chief petty officer who refused to accept the tyranny of the official parts manual. The lesson was profound and would change everything. The war in the Pacific would not be won by shipping America overseas. It would be won by adapting, by innovating, by turning the enemy's weapons, the coral, the jungle, the mud, against him. A new, far more dangerous path forward had just been cleared. The Seabees weren't just builders anymore. They were inventors. Of men, the invention of the router on Bora Bora was like a key turning in a massive, rusted lock. Suddenly, the entire island began to yield. The boneyard of broken equipment became a laboratory of innovation. Men like Pappy Haynes and his machinists were the new high priests of this strange religion of improvisation. They built mobile machine shops on the backs of trucks, taking the solution directly to the problem. When a standard crane couldn't lift a massive generator, they scavenged 2 wrecked bulldozers, anchored them, and rigged a system of pulleys and cables that would have made Archimedes weep with pride. They were no longer following the blueprints, they were rewriting them in sweat and steel. The pace of construction exploded. The airfield that had been a malarial swamp was drained, graded, and paved with a mixture of crushed coral and asphalt that baked in the tropical sun into a surface as hard as concrete. The reef that had been a ship killer was blasted into a deep water channel using dynamite charges packed into scavenged oil drums. They built piers, fuel depots, barracks, and a hospital. In a matter of weeks, they had transformed Bora Bora from a symbol of failure into the first link in the great chain of advanced bases that would eventually span the Pacific. This was the new path forward, forged in the fires of necessity. And as the lessons of the University of Bora Bora, as the men called it, were relayed back to Pearl Harbor and Washington, a new, uncomfortable truth began to dawn on the planners. Frank Reagan saw it clearly in the cables and after-action reports. Imagine you're the CEO of a massive, centuries-old corporation. You have a rigid hierarchy, a library of procedural manuals, and a culture where every decision must be approved by 10 different vice presidents. Your entire system is built on the principle of centralized control. Then, one day, you discover that your most successful, most profitable new product was invented in a remote branch office by a group of maverick employees who were ignoring all of your memos, breaking every rule in the book, and literally making things up as they went along. This is the uncomfortable truth the Seabees presented to the United States Navy. The official doctrine, the entire top-down philosophy of command and control, was not just inefficient, it was actively detrimental to winning this new kind of war. The admirals in their air-conditioned offices in Washington were trying to micromanage a construction project from 8,000 miles away, using inaccurate maps and obsolete information. They were shipping the wrong equipment to the wrong islands at the wrong time. The real intelligence, the actionable, life-or-death information, wasn't in the coded cables from Washington. It was in the hands of the bulldozer operator who knew the exact consistency of the mud on a fatah. It was in the head of the master diver who had physically walked the coral reef at Espiritu Santo. It was in the notebooks of men like Pappy Haynes, who were creating a new encyclopedia of battlefield engineering, one impossible problem at a time. The uncomfortable truth was that to win this war of islands, the Navy had to do the one thing a military bureaucracy is fundamentally designed not to do: let go. They had to decentralize. They had to trust the men on the ground. They had to empower the chief petty officers and the junior lieutenants to make decisions that would normally require an admiral's signature. This wasn't just a critique of logistics. It was a dagger aimed at the heart of the Navy's culture. It implied that the admirals and their staffs, the men who had spent their entire lives learning the grand art of strategy, were now the biggest obstacle to progress. The Seabees' success wasn't just a tactical victory, it was an organizational heresy. They were proving, on one sweltering, mosquito-infested island after another, that the man in the mud knew more than the man with the map. And for a service built on rank, tradition, and the sanctity of the chain of command, this was the most dangerous and uncomfortable truth of all. Back in Washington, the reports from the Pacific, first from Bora Bora, then from Afata, Tongatabu, and Espiritu Santo, were causing a peculiar kind of bureaucratic indigestion. On the one hand, they were undeniable success stories. Airfields were appearing in the jungle as if by magic. Harbors were being carved out of impossible coastlines. The logistical artery to Australia, once on the verge of being severed, was now pumping with the lifeblood of men and material. The Seabees were, by every practical measure, a miracle. But for Frank Reagan and the few others who understood what was really happening, these reports were read not with unalloyed pride, but with a growing sense of alarm. The system was pushing back. You have to understand the psychology of a bureaucracy at war. It craves order, predictability, and control. Its entire purpose is to manage chaos, to fit the square pegs of reality into the round holes of established procedure. The reports from the Seabees were pure, uncut chaos. They were filled with accounts of unauthorized modifications to billion-dollar equipment. They contained requisitions for materials that didn't officially exist, justified by battlefield necessities that didn't appear in any manual. They were, in essence, a chronicle of institutionalized insubordination. Imagine you are the chief accountant of a global corporation. You receive a report from a regional manager that details how he tripled his sales. Fantastic news. But then you read how he did it by ignoring the corporate pricing structure, giving away unauthorized discounts, and using the petty cash fund to buy a used delivery truck held together with duct tape. From a results-oriented perspective, he's a hero. From a systems-oriented perspective, he's a rogue agent, a virus in the machine who must be stopped before his methods infect the entire company. This was the official reaction. Reagan watched, helpless, as the system began to push back, not with malice, but with the suffocating embrace of its own logic. Memos, stamped with the authority of admirals who had never set foot on a Pacific atoll, began to circulate through his department before being dispatched to the forward bases. Cease all unauthorized modifications to earth-moving equipment. Standardized parts are to be used for all repairs. This memo arrived a week after Pappy Haynes's welders had created a mobile rock-crushing machine out of a wrecked truck and the salvaged engine from a Japanese barge. All construction projects must be preceded by a full geological survey submitted to this office for approval. This order was radioed to a battalion on Guadalcanal that was trying to rebuild a fighter strip while under active artillery fire. They used the paper for kindling. Requisitions must conform to the attached 1,200-page naval supply catalog. Items not listed will not be provisioned. This was the response to a desperate request for several tons of wire mesh. An item not in the catalog that the Seabees had discovered was the only thing that could be laid over soft ground to create temporary roads for their supply trucks. It was a battle of two realities. The ground truth of the Pacific, a world of improvisation, salvage, and desperate urgency, was crashing against the official reality of Washington, a world of regulations, supply chains, and meticulously ordered paperwork. The men on the islands were being told their greatest strengths, their ingenuity, their adaptability, their ability to get it done were now liabilities. They were being ordered to stop winning the war in their own chaotic, brilliant way and start fighting it according to a rulebook that was guaranteeing defeat. The conflict was no longer external. It was now a bitter, corrosive struggle against their own high command. The very system they were fighting to defend was now actively trying to strangle them. This is the point in the story where the investigation reaches its lowest ebb. The point where the friction between the plan on paper and the reality on the ground is no longer a matter of memos, but of life and death. For the Seabees, that moment arrived in the stinking, malarial mud of a place that would become synonymous with hell, Guadalcanal. August 1942. The Marines had landed and seized the vital, half-finished Japanese airfield, renaming it Henderson Field. But holding it was another matter entirely. The island was a fortress of mud. The daily tropical downpours turned the ground into a bottomless quagmire that swallowed trucks, planes, and hope. The airfield, the single most important strategic asset in the entire South Pacific, was a sea of ruts and standing water. Planes would get stuck taxiing for takeoff. Landing gear would collapse as fighters touched down on the unstable surface. More aircraft were being lost to the mud than to the Japanese. The Seabees of the 6th Construction Battalion arrived in this chaos. They were veterans of the early island campaigns, masters of improvisation. They took one look at the situation and knew what they had to do. They needed a new surface for the runway, something that could bear the weight of a fighter plane and drain the torrential rains. Their commander, a tough, pragmatic officer named Commander Joseph E. Farrell, sent an urgent, desperate request back to headquarters at Espiritu Santo. He didn't ask for asphalt or concrete. He knew that was a logistical fantasy. He asked for one thing: Marston matting. Now, Marston matting was a relatively new invention. It was a standardized, perforated steel planking system. The planks could be interlocked by hand, laid down over cleared ground like a carpet, and create a functional, all-weather runway in a matter of days. It was a miracle product, and the Seabees knew, with the certainty of men who lived in the mud, that it was the only thing that could save Henderson Field. The system pushed back with the full, crushing weight of its oblivious logic. The reply from the supply depot was a bureaucratic death sentence. Marston matting not designated for use in this theater. Requisition denied. Await shipment of standard paving materials. Standard paving materials meant asphalt and heavy steamrollers, which couldn't possibly be landed on the contested beaches and would sink in the mud anyway. The official report, the one sitting on a comfortable desk hundreds of miles from the fighting, had just condemned Henderson Field to a slow, muddy death. Commander Farrell was a man who had seen the boneyard at Bora Bora. He had learned the hard lessons of reality. He was faced with an impossible choice: obey the order and watch the entire Guadalcanal campaign collapse, or commit an act of career-ending piracy. He chose a third option. He sent a coded, back-channel message, not to the supply depot, but to a man he knew from the early planning days in Washington, a man he hoped still remembered what an engineer's nightmare looked like. He sent it to Lieutenant Commander Frank Reagan. The message arrived on Reagan's desk late one night, bypassing the entire chain of command. It was a desperate plea, a stark, unfiltered report from the brink of disaster. Farrell laid out the physics of the problem: the soil saturation, the sheer strength of the mud, the pointlessness of standard materials. Then he made his request, not as a subordinate to a superior, but as one engineer to another. He knew, through the Seabees' own informal intelligence network, that a massive shipment of Marston matting was sitting on the docks at Espiritu Santo, earmarked for a low-priority project. He was asking Reagan to help him steal it. For Frank Reagan, the man of rules, of blueprints, of orderly process, this was the moment of truth. He could forward the message through official channels, where it would be denied again, absolving him of responsibility. Or he could cross a line from which there was no return. He could become a co-conspirator. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly, and made a call not to an admiral, but to a contact he had in the Air Transport Command, a man who owed him a favor. He was about to commit career suicide to save a runway 8,000 miles away. The injustice of it was as thick and suffocating as the jungle air. Braiding the unfolding catastrophe on Guadalcanal was a race against two relentless enemies: the advancing Japanese forces and the island's own suffocating mud. Henderson Field was dying. Every morning, the ground crews would find the runway pockmarked with fresh bomb craters from the nightly visits of Washing Machine Charlie, the lone Japanese bomber that haunted their sleep. And every afternoon, the sky would open up, and the tropical downpours would turn those craters into miniature ponds, transforming the entire airstrip into a treacherous, unusable swamp. The Marine and Army pilots of the Cactus Air Force were flying on pure guts and adrenaline, their planes patched with so much sheet metal they looked like flying quilts. From the perspective of the ignored warning, the tragedy was layered in agonizing detail. Every pilot lost in a landing accident, every fighter plane that couldn't take off to intercept a Japanese bomber raid, was a direct consequence of that single, catastrophic teletype message: requisition denied. Commander Farrell and his Seabees watched this slow-motion disaster unfold with a feeling of impotent fury. They did what they could, working around the clock with shovels and makeshift wooden drags, a heroic but ultimately futile battle against geology and gravity. They were trying to hold back the tide with teaspoons. In Washington, Frank Reagan barely slept. He had set the wheels of his conspiracy in motion, and now there was nothing to do but wait and watch the official reports of mounting aircraft losses, each one a stab of guilt. He had organized the smuggling operation, coordinating between a sympathetic quartermaster at Espiritu Santo and the pilots of the cargo planes. He'd told them to falsify their manifests, to list the heavy steel as medical supplies or mail. Now, everything depended on whether those pilots had the nerve to go through with it. Then, one morning, just after dawn on Guadalcanal, a new sound cut through the jungle hum. It was the familiar drone of C-47 transport planes, the workhorses of the airlift. But there was something different about them. They were flying low and heavy, their engines straining. As the first plane roared over the field, its cargo doors already open, something dark tumbled out. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a supply crate. It was a bundle of long, perforated steel planks that hit the ground with a deafening clang. Marston matting. Another plane followed, and another. They didn't even try to land. It was too dangerous. They just flew low and slow, kicking the bundles of steel out onto the muddy ground beside the runway. Commander Farrell's gamble and Frank Reagan's act of treason had worked. The effect on the ground was electric. The Seabees swarmed out of their foxholes, not with weapons, but with their tools. It was as if a spell had been broken. The sight of that beautiful, ugly, life-saving steel was the physical manifestation of hope. They worked with a manic, joyous energy, heedless of the snipers in the trees or the threat of another air raid. They were builders who had finally been given something to build with. They laid the matting down like a vast, steel welcome mat. The interlocking planks were simple, rugged, and brilliant. A team of men could lay hundreds of square feet in an hour. They covered the worst of the ruts. They laid a new taxiway. They built hard stands where fighter planes could be parked and refueled without sinking into the mire. Within 72 hours, Henderson Field was transformed. It was no longer a mud patch. It was a weapon. The planes of the Cactus Air Force could now take off and land in any weather, fully loaded and fully armed. The tempo of air operations doubled, then tripled. The Japanese bombers that had once roamed freely were now being torn from the sky. The naval battles raging in the waters around the island the slot were now being decisively influenced by land-based aircraft that could launch at a moment's notice. The tide of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, and perhaps the entire Pacific War, was turning. And it was turning not on a grand strategy or a heroic charge, but on a foundation of smuggled, perforated steel laid by men who had been told it was against the rules. Archived for years, the story of the Marston matting on Guadalcanal was just that, a story. A piece of battlefield lore. In Washington, Frank Reagan and his co-conspirators held their breath, waiting for the axe to fall. An investigation was launched into the supply irregularities, but it quietly fizzled out. The manifests were forgeries, but they were official forgeries. The after-action reports for the Guadalcanal campaign spoke of the timely arrival of essential runway materials without ever mentioning the spectacular act of institutional rebellion that brought them there. The system, in its own quiet way, had papered over its own near-fatal failure. Commander Farrell was never court-martialed. He was simply a hero who had, through some unexplained miracle, managed to keep his airfield operational. Frank Reagan was never caught. The truth was buried, as it so often is, under the weight of victory. The first clue that broke the official silence came 50 years later, discovered by a university historian digging through the personal papers of a retired Air Transport Command quartermaster. Tucked into an old logbook was a single, cryptic entry: Farrell's medicine shipped. Reagan's call. God help us if they weigh the mail. It was the first piece of evidence, the thread that began to unravel the conspiracy. But the declassified file, the document that truly exposed the system's failure and vindicated the Mavericks, wasn't a dusty logbook. It was a blistering, top-secret memorandum, written 3 months after the Guadalcanal victory, from the office of the fearsome Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest J. King. The memo was addressed to the heads of every supply and logistics bureau in the Navy. An inquiry into the Henderson Field miracle had revealed the truth, and King was incandescent with rage. The declassified memo is a masterpiece of controlled fury. It reads, in part, the near disaster at Henderson Field was not the result of enemy action, but of a catastrophic failure of imagination and initiative within our own supply commands. We were nearly defeated by our own rulebooks. The fact that a frontline commander was forced to resort to unauthorized, irregular channels to acquire the single most critical asset needed to win a decisive battle is an indictment of our entire logistical philosophy. This will not happen again. The document goes on to lay out the foundation for a radical new doctrine. It formally grants theater commanders unprecedented authority to requisition and allocate resources based on immediate battlefield needs, not on pre-approved tables of organization from Washington. It empowers them to bypass the bureaucratic labyrinth in moments of crisis. It was the birth of what the modern military now calls commander's intent, giving subordinate officers the objective and the resources, and then trusting them to figure out how to achieve it. This was the declassified truth. The smuggling operation didn't just save an airfield. It was the shock to the system that forced the U.S. Navy to fundamentally change how it fought a war. The lesson wasn't that the system had worked, it was that the system had nearly killed them, and had only been saved by the courage of men willing to break its rules. Frank Reagan received a copy of that memo. He held in his hands the official, top-secret vindication of his act of treason. He, the man who began his war staring at the beautiful, logical, and fatally wrong lines on a map, now understood the deepest truth of the conflict. The war wasn't won by the men who drew the maps. It was won by the men who knew when to ignore them. The mavericks, the pirates, the improvisers, the men like Farrell on the ground, and the quiet conspirators like Reagan in the back offices, they weren't a virus in the machine. They were its essential conscience, the antibodies that fought the disease of bureaucratic inertia. The story of the Seabees was no longer just a tale of construction, it was a profound lesson in how victory is actually forged not in the clean geometry of a plan, but in the chaotic, brilliant, and insubordinate reality of the fight.